identifying early signals of opportunities and threats. That's what I'm here to talk about. It's a hot topic these days. But what I'm really interested in talking about is the fact that these signals don't just present themselves. They actually need to be decoded by studying the meaning around them. And that's what I'm going to unpack over the next few minutes. You see, the idea of discovering early signals for our business, especially signals of threats and opportunities, it's really exciting. And it makes sense that it's exciting because we're finally at a stage in our evolution as a research practice where we have access to big data. We have access to millions of consumer interactions on pretty much any and every topic imaginable in culture. So it makes sense then that we're trying to mine that data to help us identify early threats or early opportunities for our businesses, and we call them signals. But I'm here to tell you that a lot of what we identify and think are signals are actually not signals at all. They're just signs. So what does that mean? Let's imagine that you exist 1,000 years ago and you're mining for gold. It's 1,000 years ago, so you don't have a lot of the modern imaging tools and technologies at your disposal. You are using manual labor, or you are hammering away and you hit upon a rock. And imagine your excitement when you see that that rock looks like this. It's shiny. And you think you have hit gold. Little do you know, though, that actually what's before you isn't real gold. It's actually pyrite. It's fool's gold. It's one of the most abundant minerals found on Earth. And in fact, when you realize that, you also discover, much to your disappointment, that you're actually not rich. In fact, you found something that's pretty much worthless. This is a great metaphor to explain what's actually going on today in our landscape, because much of the mining activity we're doing to discover these signals is actually resulting in the identification of signs, not actual signals, just signs. What do I mean by that? Signs are actually full of meaning themselves, and the signals have to be decoded from them. A sign actually represents a system of meaning. So let's imagine that you are studying the signs or the signals around a particular topic that matters to your business. And let's imagine that you have identified a particular signal of interest. Actually, it's not a signal, it's just a sign. In order to decode the signal, what you really have to do is examine the system of meaning that that sign sits within. When you do that, you will decode the signal from it. So the signal actually results from studying the system of meaning that that sign is situated within, all the other words and topics that surround it. So I'll give you a simple example. This takes the example of turmeric and food, and ironically, turmeric is also yellow in color. So if you examine the broader context of meanings around food, you might discover that there's a sign, not a signal, a sign around turmeric. Now, if you actually miss that and you think it's a signal, you might make a bunch of decisions and go nuts and throwing turmeric at every single product launch you're doing. But if you're like me and you take a step back and think about it, you'll realize that actually turmeric isn't a signal, it's a sign. And in order to figure out what that sign really is telling us, we have to study the system of meaning that it's situated within. We have to study the system of meaning around turmeric. And when you do that, you'll discover that there are actually multiple signals, multiple systems of meaning that turmeric is situated within. One set of meanings revolves around this notion of anti-inflammation, or solving the problem of inflammation over time. Another system of meaning relates to gut health. Another one relates to functional herbs and spices, or herbs and spices with functional long-term health benefits. But you're basically discovering that there are actually 3 signals here emerging from one sign. But again, you discover that by examining the system of meaning that turmeric sits within. And the classic example of that is right here before you. Because now, if you compare the market potential for turmeric, and you compare that to the market potential and the growth potential for inflammation or anti-inflammation solutions, what you'll discover is that if you had mistaken turmeric for a signal, you would have actually underperformed. You would have underachieved and missed out on the opportunity that you would have gotten if you figured out that actually it's not about turmeric, it's about what it signifies. And the actual signal is about foods, functional herbs and spices, and foods that actually have anti-inflammatory properties. And if you had done that, not only would you have realized that there's greater growth opportunity and greater market potential, but you would have also happened to fall upon a signal that has mainstream relevancy in the next 12 to 24 months. That's significant, as opposed to a signal that is still far away from mainstream relevancy. And by the way, this data comes from our technology motive base, where we are in essence decoding the meanings around turmeric and quantifying that, and similarly decoding the meanings around anti-inflammation and quantifying that. But it helps us see how if we mistake a sign to be a signal, not only do we invest or spend our time and energy on the wrong thing, but we also potentially miss out on a pretty big payout. So it's probably a good time to talk about and define what meanings are, because I've been using the word meanings a lot. I've been talking about how in order to decode a signal, you got to figure out what system of meaning a sign is located within. So what do I mean by meaning? It's actually quite simple. Meaning comes from the words we use when we describe or understand something. So if you take the example of turmeric, when we try to understand or describe turmeric and try to make sense of it as human beings, we use words in doing so, and those words give turmeric meaning. So that's what I mean by a system of meaning. A system of meaning is nothing but the most dominant words we use as consumers when we're trying to understand and describe turmeric. And in the process of doing so, we situate turmeric in a system of meaning. And that system of meaning actually is a signal. It's not turmeric itself. It's a system that turmeric sits within. That's the exciting part, making a distinction between a sign and a signal. And here's, by the way, a real example of, and it's just a quick example, of course, but a real example of the type of words that people use when they try to describe and make sense of turmeric in culture. And you'll find words that revolve around, for example, a host of various other ingredients or herbs and spices and so on, all with some sort of health or functional health benefit. So that's one system of meaning. Others revolve around fermentation. There's actually, I'm showing you a quick sample here. So there's actually a lot of topics that revolve around fermentation, gut health, and benefits related to that. So there's that, that's another system of meaning. And then there's a whole bunch around inflammation that reflects another system of meaning. All of these point to different signals that are emerging out of a sign around turmeric. So if you actually discover that, you discover opportunities for long-term strategic initiatives for your business. So let's take another great example, and this is another hot topic these days. Obviously, sustainability is relevant to pretty much everybody's business. Now, one of the topics that is emerging and oftentimes mistaken for a signal is this idea of sustainable packaging in the broader context of sustainability. By the way, I'm referring to just the broader context of sustainability. I'm not putting an industry or a categorical lens on it. I'm just looking at what sustainability means to consumers. And in that context, there's a lot of mistaken identity, if you will, just like the pyrite case about sustainable packaging. Now, the interesting thing is if you actually examine what kind of system of meaning sustainable packaging sits within, you'll realize that a lot of it revolves around this notion of biodegradability, with consumers increasingly developing the knowledge and understanding what is truly biodegradable and what can actually degrade, so to speak. And In that context, there's a lot of discussion also about natural ingredients and natural materials used in packaging and so on. So if you actually do that, you'll discover that the real signal is actually around biodegradable packaging. And consumers are increasingly developing a more sophisticated understanding of what that means, but it's still pre-zone of innovation, i.e. it's still not ready for mainstream acceptance, but it is growing. On the other hand, if you didn't understand that and you jumped to the shiny object, to the pyrite, and you got distracted by it and focused on sustainable packaging, you would focus on something that is not only volatile in culture, i.e. people aren't sure about what this thing really is, you would also miss out on the opportunity to grow along with cultural evolution, marketplace evolution. So this is another example where a sign, a mistaken identity will prevent you from really leveraging the opportunity before you. Here's my third and final example, and I'm going to build on this example a bit more as we go along. This is an interesting one too. It's in the context of trust in the food system. And again, you'll see a sign around efficiency. And efficiency obviously is a very common topic in the context of the food system. Obviously, efficiency plays a huge role in scaling not just access to food, but also obviously everything that goes along the supply chain. Now, the interesting thing though is that when you examine the system of meaning around this concept of efficiency, what you realize, what you discover is that it's not the definition of efficiency that we might have thought sort of from a typical macro or microeconomic perspective. It's actually being redefined by the consumer. Efficiency actually refers to the use of technology to improve outcomes in animal welfare, to improve outcomes in biodiversity, to improve outcomes in healthier, more sustainable agriculture. That's what that means. So again, the sign is about efficiency. The signal is about the use of technology to achieve these kinds of results, to achieve better environmental results and better results for animal welfare and so on. So again, a clear distinction between what the sign is, what the signal is telling us. But again, it requires a little bit of decoding. We can't just, the consumer just doesn't answer every question for us. If they did, none of us would have jobs. The research industry wouldn't exist. We could just ask people what we should do next and we'd do it. That's why this is so powerful and that's why this is so important. Now, the one thing that I haven't addressed so far, and many of you may have noticed, is that every time I talk about decoding a signal or talk about a sign, I rarely talk about it in direct relationship to the underlying topic in question. It's always an indirect relationship, as you can see here, from the red zone to the blue zone, always an indirect relationship. The reason I show that is because in order to decode signals, first decode signs and then signals from it, we actually have to have the ability and have to be smart enough to remember that we have to study the broader context of discussions around a particular topic. That's how we get at signals. So let me define that for a second. It's very easy for us to go and literally search for and literally study trust in food and people who use the word trust or in the context of food. Very easy to do that. The problem with that is we don't discover signals or future signals of change. We just discover the dominant meanings, the most dominant meanings that are directly related, directly talked about in the context of trust in food. It's talked about literally in the same sentence. That's really what we're doing in that process. That's okay if we're just doing some analytics, trying to do some linguistic analysis, figure out what other things do people talk about when they use the specific words trust in food. So for example, they talk about pesticide use or profitability or genetic modification and GMOs and so on. But it's no good for signal identification. For signal identification, we have to realize that actually conversation and natural human interaction happens in more nuanced ways. So for example, I might start a conversation in a forum about trust. Somebody might respond to me, talk about profitability. From there, another threaded discussion may break out in a sub-thread where somebody talks about efficiency. From there, somebody talks about animal welfare and about regenerative agriculture and technology and biodiversity and so on. So what's happened in this situation is that efficiency is actually indirectly related to the topic of trust in food, but it's very much in context. That's what we call the broader context. The broader context is critical because identifying signs and signals requires us to actually look at those topics that are indirectly related, that are further out in the contextual boundary, that are new and developing, because that's how we can identify a sign and then decode the signal. If it's already directly related, if it's already talked about directly with this exact words, trust in food, it's not a signal anymore. It's public knowledge, it's broad knowledge in culture. There's nothing exciting new to do with it. And so that's a distinction that I think was sort of intrinsic or innate in what I was referring to thus far, but I just wanted to make sure I define that as we continue in this journey. Now, the broader context becomes critical because once we identify the sign within the broader context, then we can eliminate everything else and figure out what that sign really means. So the act of discovering the signal actually requires us to decouple the sign from its underlying context to figure out, okay, what sort of, or what sets of meanings is this particular sign attached to or situated within? And that's how we discover the new and emerging signals that can eventually have impacts not just on our core business, but on adjacencies and actually drive transformative ideas and change. So eventually this is what it comes down to, right? It comes down to a framework where we can't get at signals if we're just looking at the direct literal meanings around a topic. We have to spread the net wider to the broader context. We have to find a way to study the broader context of discussions around a topic. Once we do that, we have to go beyond the dominant broader contextual meanings to actually uncover the not so dominant contextual meanings and contextual topics. And that's how we get at signals. Signals are further away from the sun, right? There's a longer distance to travel for these signals. And that's what makes them signals. That's what makes them early stage. They're not already directly related and literally related to the topic at hand. And we have to be able to understand that and examine that. And that's how we can identify the signs and then obviously decode the signals from them. So how do we bring this all back together? How do we go from a sign to a signal? First of all, very important, this is your essential checklist, right? You have to start by building an algorithm, start by examining data in the broader context of a business topic or an issue that's relevant to your business. Examine the broader context, check. Once you do that, then the next step is to make sure that whenever you think you've got a signal, take a step back and consider it a sign. Unless otherwise proven to be a signal, consider it a sign. Once you have that sign, eliminate the underlying context from it and examine the system of meaning that that sign is situated within. When you do that, you will figure out what the actual signals are that that sign is attached to. Sometimes there's multiple signals, sometimes there's just one major signal, but that's for you to decode. And then in cases where there are multiple signals, you can actually compare and contrast them to figure out which signal offers better value to your business and offer better congruency with your strategic or better strategic alignment and so on. But the critical thing to remember is that the signal has to be decoded. The consumer isn't just throwing signals at you. It has to be decoded through some smart data analysis. And that's really what I wanted to leave you with today. Ultimately, it's all about realizing that a sign is situated within a system of meaning. When we figure that out, we can figure out the signal. And when we arrive at those signals, it opens the door for us to examine broader strategic initiatives, broader opportunities that we can chase down that will have a greater impact on our businesses and will ensure that we don't chase down pyrites and shiny objects that may give us short-term lift, but will not have any longevity and certainly will not benefit our businesses in the long run. I thank you for your time. And I'm open to questions and I'm happy to take and address any questions that come along. My email address is also on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have a conversation, not just about my business, but about the industry in general. It's always exciting to learn about all the challenges that all of you face and what you're doing to overcome them as well. Thank you.